Okay, the birth of Biopolitics, lectures by Michel Foucault at the College of France, 1978-79. This is lecture number 6, given on 14th of February, 1979. Today I would like to continue with what I began to say about German neoliberalism. When you talk about contemporary neoliberalism, whether German or any other kind, you generally get 3 types of response. The first is that from the economic point of view, neoliberalism is no more than the reactivation of old second-hand economic theories. The second is that from the sociological point of view, it is just a way of establishing strictly market relations in society. And finally, the third response is that from a political point of view, neoliberalism is no more than a cover for a generalized administrative intervention by the state, which is all the more profound for being insidious and hidden beneath the appearances of a neoliberalism. You can see that these 3 types of response ultimately make neoliberalism out to be nothing at all, or anyway, nothing but always the same thing, and always the same thing but worse. That is to say, it is just Adam Smith revived. Second, it is the market society that was decoded and denounced in Book 1 of Capital. And third, it is the generalization of state power, that is to say, it is Solzhenitsyn on a world scale. Adam Smith, Marx, Solzhenitsyn, laissez-faire, society of the market and spectacle, the world of the concentration camp and the gulag. Broadly speaking, these are the 3 analytical and critical frameworks with which this problem of neoliberalism is usually approached, and which therefore enable it to be turned into practically nothing at all. Repeating the same type of critique for 200, 100, or 10 years. Now, what I would like to show you is precisely that neoliberalism is really something else. Whether it is of great significance or not, I don't know, but surely it is something. And I would like to try to grasp it in its singularity. If it is true that important and even invaluable political effects can be produced by historical analysis, which present themselves precisely as historical and which seek to detect types of practice, institutional forms, etc., which exist and function for a time in certain places, if it is important to show what a mechanism like the prison was given at a given moment, and to see what effect this purely historical type of analysis produces in a present situation. This absolutely never consists in saying, either implicitly or with more reason explicitly, that what existed then is the same as what exists now. The problem is to let knowledge of the past work on the experience of the present. It is not at all a matter of coding the present in a form that is recognized in the past but still reckoned to be valid in the present. It is this transfer of the political effects of an historical analysis in the form of a simple repetition that is undoubtedly what is to be avoided at any cost, and that is why I stress the problem of neoliberalism in order to try to detach it from these critiques made on the basis of the pure and simple transposition of historical molds. Neoliberalism is not Adam Smith. Neoliberalism is not market society. Neoliberalism is not the gulag on the insidious scale of capitalism. So what is this neoliberalism? Last week I tried to indicate at least its theoretical and political principle. I tried to show you how the problem of neoliberalism was not how to cut out or contrive a free space of the market within an already given political society, as in the liberalism of Adam Smith in the 18th century. The problem of neoliberalism is rather how the overall exercise of political power can be modeled on the principles of a market economy. So it is not a question of freeing an empty space, but of taking the formal principles of a market economy and referring and relating them to, of projecting them onto a general art of government. This, I think, is what is at stake. And I tried to show you that in order to carry out this operation, that is to say, to discover how far and to what extent the formal principles of a market economy can index a general art of government. The neoliberals had to subject classical liberalism to a number of transformations. The first of these, which I tried to show you last week, was basically that of dissociating the market economy from the political principle of laissez-faire. I think this uncoupling of the market economy and laissez-faire policies was achieved, or was defined at any rate. Its principle was laid down when the neoliberals put forward a theory of pure competition, in which competition was not presented as in any way a primitive and natural given, the very source and foundation of society that only had to be allowed to rise to the surface and be rediscovered, as it were. Far from it being this, competition was a structure with formal properties. And it was these formal properties of the competitive structure that assured and could assure economic regulation through the price mechanism. Consequently, if competition was what really was this formal structure, both rigorous in its internal structure but fragile in its real historical existence, then the problem of liberal policy was precisely to develop, in fact, the concrete and real space in which the formal structure of competition could function. So it is a matter of a market economy without laissez-faire. That is to say, an active policy without state control. Neoliberalism should not, therefore, be identified with laissez-faire, but rather with permanent vigilance, activity, and intervention. This is very clear in most of the neoliberal texts, and there is one to which I refer you, if you can find it, for it is not easy to find. It was strangely lost by the Bibliothèque Nationale, but you will certainly find it at the Musée Social. This text is the summary of the contributions made in 1939, on the eve of the war, in a colloquium called the Walter Lippmann Colloquium. It was held in France following the publication of Lippmann's book, which was translated into French with the title La Cité Libre. It is a curious book because, on the one hand, it takes up the themes of classical liberalism in the form of a pure and simple reactivation, but on the other hand, in a number of respects, it also presents elements that form part of neoliberalism. His book had just appeared in the United States, was translated into French, and a colloquium was held in Paris, in which Walter Lippmann himself took part along with old liberals of the classical tradition. Some French people like Baudin, for example, and then some of the German or Austrian neoliberals, those precisely who formed part of the Freiburg School, some of whom were exiled from Germany and others silenced in Germany, and for whom the colloquium was an opportunity for them to express their point of view. Ropke, Rousseau, Hayek, and von Mises took part in the colloquium. And then there were the intermediaries, Jacques Rueff, Marjolin, who is nonetheless important in the post-war French economy, and the General Secretary of the Congress, Raymond Aron, who did not speak, or at least does not appear in the proceedings. Following the colloquium, I just signal this because there are people who are particularly interested in the structures of the signifier. It is decided in July 1939 to form a permanent committee that will be called Comité International d'Études pour le Renouveau du Libéralisme, CIERL. In the course of this colloquium, the specific propositions peculiar to neoliberalism are defined. You will find this in the summary sprinkled with other theses and themes of classical liberalism. And one of the participants, I no longer know which one, proposes the extremely significant expression, positive liberalism. And the name for the neoliberalism being formulated. Okay, and one of the participants, I no longer know which one, proposes the extremely significant expression positive liberalism as the name for the neoliberalism being formulated. Positive liberalism, then, is an intervening liberalism. It is a liberalism about which Ropke, in the Gesellschaftskrisis, which he published shortly after the Lippmann Colloquium, says, "The free market requires an active and extremely vigilant policy." In all the texts of the neoliberals, you find the theme that government is active, vigilant, and intervening in a liberal regime, and formulae that neither the classical liberalism of the 19th century nor the contemporary American anarcho-capitalism could accept. Eucken, for example, says, "The state is responsible for the result of economic activity." Franz Bohm says, "The state must master economic development." Michel says, "In this liberal policy," and here the phrase is important, "there may be as many economic interventions as in a policy of planning, but their nature is different." Well, I think this problem of the nature of the interventions gives us a starting point for approaching what is specific in neoliberal policy. As you know, broadly speaking, the problem of the liberalism in the 18th century and the start of the 19th century was to distinguish between actions that must be taken and actions that must not be taken, between domains in which one can intervene and domains in which one cannot intervene. This was the distinction between the agenda and the non-agenda. This is a naive position in the eyes of the neoliberals, for whom the problem is not whether there are things that you cannot touch and others that you are entitled to touch. The problem is how you touch them. The problem is the way of doing things. The problem, if you like, of governmental style. I will take 3 examples to locate how the neoliberals define the style of governmental action. I will be schematic, brief, and stark, but you will see that these are things with which you are certainly familiar, since we are in fact immersed in them. I would just like to point out schematically 3 things. First, the question of monopoly. Second, the problem of what the neoliberals call a conformable economic action. Action économique conforme. And third, the problem of social policy. Then, on the basis of this, I will try to indicate some of what seem to me to be specific features of this neoliberalism, which absolutely oppose them to everything one generally thinks one is criticizing when one criticizes the liberal policy of neoliberalism. First, then, I will take the question of monopolies. Once again, forgive me, this is very banal, but I think we need to go back over this, at least to bring some problems up to date. Let's say that in the classical conception, or one of the classical conceptions of the economy, monopoly is seen as a semi-natural, semi-necessary consequence of competition in a capitalist regime. That is to say, competition cannot be left to develop without monopolistic phenomena appearing at the same time, which precisely have the effect of limiting, attenuating, and even nullifying competition. Thus, a feature of the historico-economic logic of competition would be for it to suppress itself. This implying, of course, that any liberal who wants to assure the operation of free competition must, in fact, intervene within the economy on those economic mechanisms that facilitate, bring with them, and determine monopolistic phenomena. That is to say, if you want to save competition from its own effects, then there are times when you must act on economic mechanisms. This is the paradox of monopoly for a liberal economics, which raises the problem of competition, and at the same time accepts the idea that monopoly is actually part of the logic of competition. Of course, as you can imagine, the position of the neoliberals will be completely different, and their problem will be to demonstrate that monopoly, the monopolistic tendency, is not in fact part of the economic and historical logic of competition. Ropke, in the Gesellschaft crisis, says that monopoly is a foreign body in the economic process and does not develop within it spontaneously. To support this thesis, the neoliberals deploy a number of arguments that I will pick out for you just for information. First, there are arguments of an historical type. Namely, that monopoly, far from being a sort of ultimate final phenomena in the history of liberal economy, is an archaic phenomenon, the source of which is the intervention of public authorities in the economy. After all, if there is a monopoly, it is because the public authorities, or those at the time assured the functions and exercise of public power, granted privileges to corporations and workshops It is because states and sovereigns granted monopolies to individuals or families in exchange for financial services in the form of a sort of derivative or concealed tax system. This was the case, for example, with monopoly granted to the Foucault family by Maximilian I in exchange for financial services. In short, the development in the Middle Ages of a tax system that was itself a condition of the growth of centralized power brought about the creation of monopolies. Monopoly is an archaic phenomenon and a phenomenon of intervention. There is also a juridical analysis of the conditions whereby the law functioned to allow or facilitate monopoly. How were inheritance practices, the existence of a law of joint stock companies, the problem of patent rights, and so on, able to give rise to phenomena of monopoly? Not for economic reasons, but due to the functioning of law. Here, the neoliberals raised a whole series of problems that are more historical and institutional than specifically economic, but which opened the way to very interesting research on the political institutional framework of the development of capitalism, and from which the American neoliberals benefited. The ideas of North on the development of capitalism, for example, are directly in line with this opening up made by the neoliberals, the problematic of which appears clearly in several contributions to the Lippmann Colloquium. Another argument to show that the monopolistic phenomenon does not belong in principle or logically to the economics of competition is found in political analysis on the link between the existence of a national economy, protectionist customs barriers, and monopoly. Von Mies, for example, analyzed this a number of times. He shows how monopolistic phenomena are facilitated by division into national markets, which, by reducing economic units to relatively small dimensions, effectively allow the existence within this framework of monopoly phenomena, which would not remain in a world economy. More positively and directly, he shows how protectionism, in fact decided on by a state, can only be effective inasmuch as you create or call for the existence of cartels or monopolies, which are capable of controlling production, foreign sales, price levels, and so on. This was, broadly speaking, Bismarck's policy. Third, economically, the neoliberals say that classical analysis is true when it says that in capitalism, the necessary increase in fixed capital is an undeniable support for the tendency towards concentration and monopoly. However, they say in the first place, this tendency does not necessarily and inevitably result in monopoly. There is, of course, an optimum level of concentration around which the capitalist regime tends to balance. But between this optimum of concentration and the maximum represented by the fact of monopoly, there is a threshold that cannot be crossed spontaneously as the direct effect of competition, as the direct effect of economic processes. There must be what Rusto calls predatory neo-feudalism, which must also receive the support of the state, laws, courts, and public opinion in order to pass from optimum concentration to the maximum of monopoly. And then Rope says, in any case, even if the phenomenon of monopoly exists, it is not in itself stable. That is to say, in the medium term, if not in the short term, in the economic process, there are always either modifications of productive forces or technical modifications or massive increases in productivity. Or again, the appearance of new markets. And all this means that the evolution towards monopoly can only be one variable which functions for a certain time among other variables which will be dominant at other times. In its overall dynamic, the economy of competition includes a series of variables in which the tendency to concentration is always counterbalanced by other tendencies. Finally, and it is still von Mies reasoning in this way, what is it, fundamentally, that is important, or rather disturbing about the phenomenon of monopoly with regard to the functioning of the economy? Is it the fact that there is only one producer? Absolutely not. Is it the fact that there is only one enterprise with the right to sell? Absolutely not. Monopoly has a disturbing effect inasmuch as it acts on prices, that it is to say, on the regulatory mechanism of the economy. Now we can very well imagine, and it regularly happens in fact, that the monopoly price, that is to say, a price which can rise without either a fall in sales or profits, is not and cannot be applied by monopolies themselves. Because as a result of applying the monopoly price, they are always exposed to the appearance of competition, which will take advantage of the existence of these abusive prices in order to hit back at the monopoly. Consequently, if a monopoly wishes to retain its monopolistic power, it will have to apply not the monopoly price, but a price identical, or at any rate close to the price of competition. That is to say, it will act as if there were competition. And then it will not disrupt the market. It will not disrupt the price mechanism. And the monopoly will not be important. The structure that is so important and the determinant phenomenon in competition is made to function by practicing this competitive policy of the as if. And to that extent, it is basically not relevant whether or not there is a monopoly. All this merely situates how the neoliberals want to pose the problem. In a way, they are freed from this problem of the handicap of monopoly. They can say, you can see that there is no need to intervene directly in the economic process, since the economic process, as the bearer in itself of a regulatory structure in the form of competition, will never go wrong if it is allowed to function fully. What constitutes the specific property of competition is the formal rigor of its process. But what guarantees that this formal process will not go wrong? In that, in reality, if one lets it function, nothing will come from competition, from the economic process itself. That is of such a nature that it will change the course of this process. Consequently, the non-intervention is necessary at this level. Non-intervention is necessary on condition, of course, that an institutional framework is established to prevent either individuals or public authorities intervening to create a monopoly. And thus you find an enormous anti-monopolistic institutional framework in German legislation, the function of which is not at all to intervene in the economic field to prevent the economy itself from producing the monopoly, but whose function is to prevent external processes from intervening and creating monopolistic phenomena. The second important point in this neoliberal program is the question of conformable actions. Action conforme. This theory of conformable actions, this programming of conformable actions, is essentially found in a text which was actually one of the great charters of contemporary German policy. It is a posthumous text by Eucken, which appeared in 1951 or 52, called Grundsatz der Wirtschaftspolitik, the foundations of economic policy, and which is, as it were, the other practical side of the text called Grundlagen der Nationalökonomie, published a dozen years earlier, which was the theoretical side. In this foundations, these fundamental principles of economic policy, Eucken tells us that liberal government must be perpetually vigilant and active, must intervene in two ways. First, through the regulatory actions, action régulatrice, and second, through organizing actions, action ordonnatrice. Regulatory actions, first of all. We should not forget that Eucken is the son of Eucken, the neo-Kantian Nobel Prize winner of the beginning of the 20th century. As a good Kantian, Eucken says, how should government intervene? It should intervene in the form of regulatory actions. That is to say, it must intervene, in fact, on economic processes when intervention is imperative for conjunctural reasons. The economic process always leads to temporary frictions, to modifications which risk giving rise to exceptional situations with difficulties of adaptation and more or less serious repercussions on some groups It is necessary, then, he says, not to intervene on the mechanisms of the market economy, but on the conditions of the market, rigorously following the Kantian idea of regulation. Intervening on the conditions of the market would mean identifying, accepting, and giving free play to the three typical and fundamental tendencies in the market. But in order to encourage these tendencies and somehow push them to their limit and full reality, these three tendencies are the tendency to the reduction of costs, the tendency to the reduction of the profit of the enterprise, and finally, the provisional, localized tendency to increased profit, either through a decisive and massive reduction of prices, or by an improvement in production. These are the three tendencies that regulation of the market, that regulatory action must take in account, inasmuch as they are themselves tendencies of the regulation of the market. In clear terms, this means, first of all, that the main objective of regulatory action will necessarily be price stability, understood not as fixed prices, but as control of inflation. So I need to reload the water distiller. Consequently, all other objectives apart from price stability can only be secondary, and, so to speak, adjuncts. At any rate, they can never be the primary objective. In particular, the primary objectives must not be the maintenance purchasing power, the maintenance of full employment, or even balancing the balance of payments. Second, what does this mean for the instruments to be used? It means, first of all, using the policy of credit, that is to say, establishing the discount rate. It means using foreign trade by reducing the credit balance. When you want to contain the rise in foreign prices, shifts in taxation will also be employed. but always moderate ones, when seeking to act on saving or investment. But none of the kind of instruments used by planning will be resorted to, namely price control, support for a particular sector of the market, systematic job creation, or public investment. All these forms of intervention must be rigorously banished and replaced by the pure market instruments I have just mentioned. The neoliberal policy with regard to unemployment in particular is perfectly clear. Whatever the rate of unemployment, in a situation of unemployment, you absolutely must not intervene directly or in the first place on the unemployment, as if full employment should be a political idea and an economic principle to be saved at any cost. What is to be saved, first of all and above all, is the stability of prices. Price stability will in fact allow, subsequently no doubt, both the maintenance of purchasing power and the existence of a higher level of employment than in an unemployment crisis. But full employment is not an objective, and it may be that a reserve of unemployment is absolutely necessary for the economy. As I think it was Rope said, what is an unemployed person? He is not someone suffering from an economic disability. He is not a social victim. He is a worker in transit. He is a worker in transit between an unprofitable activity and a more profitable activity. These, then, are the regulatory actions. Okay. This one's going deep, Mr. Hodo. All right. Organizing actions are more interesting. However, because they bring us closer to the specific object. What are organizing actions? Well, they are actions with the function of intervening on conditions of the market, but on more fundamental, structural, and general conditions of the market than those I have just been talking about. In fact, we should never forget the principle that the market is a general social and economic regulator. But this does not mean it is a natural given to be found at the very basis of society. Rather, it constitutes, forgive me for saying it once again, a sort of fine and very reliable mechanism on condition that it functions well and nothing disturbs it. Consequently, the main and constant concern of governmental intervention, apart from these conjunctural moments I have just spoken about, must be the conditions of existence of the market, that is to say, what the Ordo liberals call the framework. What is a framework policy? I think it will appear clearly if we consider a text from Euclid's Grundsatz, that is to say, from 1952, where he takes up the problem of German agriculture, although he says the same arguments apply to most of European agriculture. Basically, he says agriculture has never been normally, fully, and exhaustively integrated within the market economy. It has not been integrated within the market economy because of protective customs that throughout Europe have marked off and cut out the spaces of European agriculture. These protective customs were made indispensable both by technical differences and generally by the technical inadequacy of each country's agriculture. These differences and inadequacies were entirely linked to an overpopulation that made intervention, the insertion of technical improvements, pointless and, in truth, undesirable. So what must be done if we want European agriculture to function within a market economy? The text is from 1952. We will have to act on facts that are not directly economic facts, but which are conditioning facts for a possible market economy. So on what will it be necessary to act? Not on prices, and certainly not on a particular sector. Ensuring support for a scarcely profitable sector, since these are bad interventions. What will good interventions act on? Well, on the framework. That is to say, first, on the population. The agricultural population is too large, so it will have to be reduced by interventions enabling population transfers, migration, and so on. We will also have to intervene at the level of techniques by making implements available. By the technical improvement of elements like fertilizers, etc. And also by the training and education given to farmers. Which will enable them to modify agricultural techniques. Third, we will also modify the legal framework of farms, and in particular the laws governing inheritance, governing tenant farms, and the location of estates, trying to find the means to get the legislation, structures, and institutions of society to play a part through action in agriculture, and so on. Fourth, as far as possible, we will modify the allocation of the soil and the extent, nature, and exploitation of the soil available. Finally, if necessary, we will have to be able to intervene on the climate. You can see that none of these elements, population, technology, training and education, the legal system, the availability of land, the climate, are directly economic, and they do not affect market mechanisms directly. But for Ukin, they are conditions for agriculture to be able to function as a market, for agriculture to be able to function within a market. The idea was not, given the state of things, how can we find the economic system that will be able to take account of the basic facts peculiar to European agriculture? It was given that economic political regulation can only take place through the market. How can we modify these material, cultural, technical, and legal bases that are given in Europe? How can we modify these facts, this framework, so that the market economy can come into play? You can see here something that I will return to shortly, which is that to the same extent that governmental intervention must be light at the level of economic processes themselves, so must it be heavy when it is a matter of this set of technical, scientific, legal, geographic, let's say broadly, social factors, which now increasingly become the object of governmental intervention. What is more, you can see in passing that this 1952 text programs, even if in a completely rough and ready way, what will become the common agricultural market of the next decade. The text is from 1952. The Mansholt Plan is already in Eucken, or it is in part in Eucken in 1952. So there you are for conformable actions, for conjunctural actions and organizing actions at the level of the framework. This is what they call the organization of a market order, of an order of competition. And this is actually what European agricultural policy is. How to reconstruct a competitive order that will regulate the economy. The third aspect in social policy. Here again, I will have to be elusive because for reasons of both time and competence, I cannot go into details. However, we should agree to a number of things that are, if you like, banal and boring, but which enable us to locate some important elements. That is, what is a social policy in a welfare economy? That is to say, in the kind of economy programmed by Pigou and then taken up in one way or another by Keynesian economists, the New Deal, the Beveridge Plan, and by European post-war plans. A social policy is, broadly speaking, a policy with the objective of everybody having relatively equal access to consumer goods. How is this social policy conceptualized in a welfare economy? First of all, it is conceptualized as a counterweight to unrestrained economic processes which it is reckoned will induce inequality and generally destructive effects on society if left to themselves. So the nature of social policy should be a kind of counterpoint to economic processes. Second, what should the major instrument of social policy be in a welfare economy? It should be socialization of some elements of consumption. The appearance of a form of what is called socialized or collective consumption, medical consumption, cultural consumption, etc. A second instrument is the transfer of elements of income in the form of family allowances. Finally, third, a social policy in a welfare economy is acceptance of the principle that stronger growth should entail a more active, intense, and generous social policy as a kind of reward and compensation. Ordo-liberalism very quickly raised doubts about these three principles. In the first place, they say that if you really want to integrate social policy into economic policy, And if you do not want social policy to be destructive in relation to economic policy, then it cannot serve as a counterweight. It must not be defined as compensation for the effects of the economic processes. In particular, relative equalization, the evening out of access to consumer goods, cannot in any case be an objective. It cannot be an objective in a system where economic regulation, that is to say, the price mechanism, is not obtained through phenomena of equalization, but through a game of differentiations which is characteristic of every mechanism of competition and which is established through fluctuations that only perform their function and only produce their regulatory effects on condition that they are left to work and left to work through differences. In broad terms, for regulations to take effect, there must be those who work and those who don't. There must be big salaries and small salaries, and also prices must rise and fall. Consequently, a social policy with the objective of even a relative equalization, even a relative evening out, can only be anti-economic. Social policy cannot have equality as its objective. On the contrary, it must let inequality function, and I no longer recall who it was. I think it was Ropke, who said that people complain of inequality, but what does it mean? Inequality, he said, is the same for all. This formula may seem enigmatic, but it can be understood when we consider that for the ordoliberals, the economic game, along with the unequal effects it entails, is a kind of general regulator of society that clearly everyone has to accept and abide by. So there is no equalization as a consequence, and more precisely, no transfer of income from some to others. More particularly, a transfer of income is dangerous when it is withdrawn from the part of income that generates and saving and investment. This deduction would thus mean withdrawing a part of income from investment and transferring it to consumption. The only thing one can do is deduct from the highest incomes a part that would in any case be devoted to consumption, or let's say to overconsumption, and transfer this part of overconsumption to those who find themselves in a state of underconsumption due to permanent disability or unforeseen events, but nothing more. So you can see that social transfers are of a very limited character. Broadly speaking, it is not a matter of maintaining purchasing power, but merely of ensuring a vital minimum for those who, either permanently or temporarily, would not be able to ensure their own existence. It involves only the marginal transfer from a minimum to a maximum. It is absolutely not the establishment of or regulation around an average. Second, the instrument of this social policy, if it can be called a social policy, will not be the socialization of consumption and income. On the contrary, it can only be privatization. That is to say, society as a whole will not be asked to guarantee individuals against risks, whether these are individual risks like illness or accidents, or collective risks like damage, for example. Society will not be asked to guarantee individuals against these risks. Society, or rather the economy, will merely be asked to see to it that every individual has sufficient income to be able, either directly and as an individual, or through the collective means of mutual benefit organizations, to insure himself against existing risks, or the risks of life, the inevitability of old age and death, and on the basis of his own private reserves. That is to say, social policy will have to be a policy which, instead of transferring one part of income to another part, will use as its instrument the most generalized capitalization possible for all the social classes, the instrument of individual and mutual insurance, and in short, the instrument of private property. This is what the Germans call an individual social policy, as opposed to a socialist social policy. It involves an individualization of social policy and individualization through social policy instead of collectivization and socialization and in social policy. In short, it does not involve providing individuals with a social cover for risks, but according everyone a sort of economic space within which they can take on and confront risks. This leads us to the conclusion that there is only one true and fundamental social policy: economic growth. The fundamental form of social policy must not be something that works against economic policy and compensates for it. Social policy must not follow strong economic growth by becoming more generous. Economic growth, and only economic growth, should enable all individuals to achieve a level of income that will allow them the individual insurance, access to private property, and individual or familial capitalization with which to absorb risks. This is what Muller-Armack, Chancellor Erhard's counselor around 1952-53, called the social market economy, which is also the name for German social policy. I add immediately that, in fact, this drastic program of social policy defined by the neoliberals was not and could not be strictly applied in Germany for a whole range of reasons. German social policy was ballasted by a wide range of elements, some of which derived from Bismarckian state socialism, others from Keynesian economics, and others from the Beveridge plans or European social security plans. So that on this point, the neoliberals, the German Ordo liberals, could not fully recognize themselves in German policy. However, I want to emphasize 2 points. First of all, it was starting from this and from the rejection of this social policy that American anarcho-capitalism developed. And second, it is also important to see that, in spite of everything, social policy increasingly tends to follow this program, at least in those countries increasingly aligned with neoliberalism. The idea of a privatization of insurance mechanisms, and the idea at any rate that it is up to the individual to protect himself against risks through all the reserves he has at his disposal, either simply as an individual or through mutual benefit organizations and such like, is the objective you can see at work in the neoliberal policies currently being pursued in France. This is the tendency. Privatized social policy. Forgive me for being so prolix and banal on all this history, but I think it was important in order to bring out now a number of things that seem to me to form the, how to put it, original armature of neoliberalism. The first point to underline is that as you can see, and as the neoliberals have always said, neoliberal governmental intervention is no less dense, frequent, active, and continuous than any other system. But what is important is to see what the point of application of these governmental interventions is now. Since this is a liberal regime, it is understood that government must not intervene on effects of the market, nor must neoliberalism or neoliberal government correct the destructive effects of the market on society. And it is this that differentiates it from, let's say, welfare or such like policies that we have seen from the 20s to the 60s. Government must not form a counterpoint or screen, as it were, between society and economic processes. It has to intervene on society as such, in its fabric and depth. Basically, it has to intervene on society so that competitive mechanisms can play a regulatory role at every moment and every point in society. And by intervening in this way, its objective will become possible. That is to say, a general regulation of society by the market. So this will not be the kind of economic government imagined by the physiocrats, that is to say, a government which only has to recognize and observe economic laws. It is not an economic government. It is a government of society. What's more, one of the participants in the Lippmann colloquium, who in 1939 was looking for his new definition of liberalism, said, "Could we not call it a sociological liberalism?" In any case, it is a government of society. What the neoliberals want to construct is a policy of society. Moreover, Müller-Armack gave Erhard's policy the significant term of Gesellschaftspolitik, a policy of society. The words mean, however, what they say, and the trajectory of the words actually indicates the processes that they can. In 1969 and 1970, Chaban presented his economic and social policy as a project of society. That is to say, he quite clearly identifies society as the target and objective of governmental practice. At this point, we pass from a, broadly speaking, Keynesian type of system, which had more or less lingered on in Gaullist policy, to a new art of government, which will be taken up by Giscard. This is the point of fracture. The object of governmental action is what the Germans call die Sozialumwelt, the social environment. So what does this sociological government want to do in relation to this society that has now become the object of governmental intervention and practice? It wants, of course, to make the market possible, to play the role of general regulator, of principle, of political rationality. The market must be possible. But what does it mean to introduce market regulation as regulatory principle of society? Does it mean establishing a market society, that is to say, a society of commodities, of consumption, in which exchange value will be at the same time the general measure and criterion of the elements, the principle of communication between individuals, and the principle of the circulation of things? In other words, does this neoliberal art of government involve normalizing and disciplining society on the basis of the market value and form? Does this not return us to the model of mass society, of the society of consumption, of commodities, the spectacle, simulacra, and the speed that Sombart defined for the first time in 1903? I don't think so, in fact. It is not market society that is at stake in this new art of government. It is not a question of reconstructing that kind of society. The society regulated by reference to the market that the neoliberals are thinking about is a society in which the regulatory principle should not be so much the exchange of commodities as the mechanisms of competition. It seemed like I grew up in the society of, Potato Man. too distracted and busy to think about twoof. Okay, here we go. It is these mechanisms that should have the greatest possible surface and depth, and should also occupy the greatest possible volume in society. This means that what is sought is not a society subject to the commodity effect, but a society subject to the dynamic of competition, not a supermarket society, but an enterprise society. The homo economicus sought after is not the man of exchange or the man, the consumer. He is the man of enterprise and production. We find ourselves here at an important point to which I will try to come back to next week. It is a point of intersection of a whole series of things. First, of course, is the analysis of the enterprise that developed from the 19th century. To a considerable extent, the historical, economic, and moral analysis of the nature of the enterprise and the series of works on the enterprise by Weber, Sombart, and Schumpeter actually support the neoliberal analysis or project. So, if there is something like a return in neoliberal politics, it is certainly not a return to the governmental practice of laissez-faire, and it is not a return to the kind of market society that Marx denounced at the beginning of Book 1 of Capital. There is an attempt to return to a sort of social ethic of the enterprise, of which Weber, Sombart, and Schumpeter tried to write the political, cultural, and economic history. More concretely, if you like, in 1950, Ropke wrote a text entitled The Orientation of German Economic Policy, which was published with a preface by Adenauer. What does Ropke identify in this text, this charter, as the object, the final aim, the ultimate objective of governmental action? I will list the objective he fixes. First, to enable as far as possible everyone to have access to private property. Second, the reduction of huge urban sprawls and the replacement of large suburbs with a policy of medium-sized towns. The replacement of the policy and economics of large housing blocks with a policy and economics of private houses. The encouragement of small farms in the countryside, and the development of what he calls the non-proletarian industries, that is to say, craft industries and small businesses. Third, decentralization of places of residence, production, and management. Correction of the effects of specialization and the division of labor, and the organic reconstruction of society on the basis of natural communities, families, and neighborhoods. Finally, generally organizing, developing, and controlling possible effects on the environment arising either from people living together or through the development of enterprises and centers of production. Broadly speaking, Rope says in 1950, it is a question of shifting the center of gravity of governmental action downwards. You will recognize this text. It has been repeated 25,000 times for the last 25 years. In fact, it currently constitutes the theme of governmental action. And it would certainly be false to see it as no more than a cover, a justification, and a screen behind which something else is going on. At any rate, we should try to take it as it is given. That is to say, well and truly as a program of rationalization and of economic rationalization. What does this involve? Well, when we look a bit more closely, we may of course hear it as a kind of more or less Rousseau-esque return to nature. Something that Rusto called, moreover, with a very ambiguous word, a Biopolitics, a politics of life. But what is this Biopolitics that Rusto talks about? And of which this is an expression. Actually, as you can see, it is not a matter of constructing a social fabric in which the individual would be in direct contact with nature, but of constructing a social fabric in which precisely the basic units would have the form of the enterprise. For what is private property if not an enterprise? What is a house if not an enterprise? What is the management of these small neighborhood communities if not other forms of enterprise? In other words, what is involved is the generalization of forms of enterprise by diffusing and multiplying them as much as possible. Enterprises which must not be focused on the form of big national or international enterprises or the type of big enterprises of a state. I think this multiplication of the enterprise form within the social body is what is at stake in neoliberal policy. It is a matter of making the market competition and so the enterprise into what could be called the formative power of society. To what extent? You can see that we are at the crossroads where a number of old themes are revived concerning family life, co-ownership, and a whole range of recurrent themes criticizing market society and standardization through consumption. And it is in this sense that we see a convergence. Without this being anything like a recuperation, a word which has no meaning, strictly speaking, between the Sombartian style of criticism of around 1900 against standardizing market society, etc., and the objectives of current governmental policy. They actually want the same thing. Quite simply, those who denounce a Sombartian society in inverted commas, I mean the standardizing mass society, of consumption and spectacle, etc., are mistaken when they think they are criticizing the current objective of governmental power, a policy. Okay, again, quite simply, those who denounce a Sombartian society in inverted commas, I mean that standardizing mass society of consumption and spectacle, etc., are mistaken when they think they are criticizing the current objective of governmental policy. They are criticizing something else. They are criticizing something that was certainly on the explicit or implicit horizon, willed or not, of the arts of government from the 20s to the 60s. But we have gone beyond that stage. We are no longer there. The art of government programmed by the Ordo liberals around the 1930s, and which has now become the program of most governments in capitalist countries, absolutely does not seek the constitution of that type of society. It involves, on the contrary, obtaining a society that is not orientated towards the commodity and the uniformity of the commodity, but towards the multiplicity and differentiation of enterprises. That is the first thing I wanted to say. The second, but I really don't think I have time now. The second consequence of this liberal art of government is profound changes in the system of law and the juridical institution. For in fact, there is a privileged connection between a society oriented towards the form of the enterprise and a society in which the most important public service is the judicial institution. The more you multiply enterprises, the more you multiply the centers of formation of something like an enterprise, and the more you force governmental action to let these enterprises operate, then, of course, the more you multiply these surfaces of friction between each of these enterprises, the more you multiply opportunities for disputes, the more you multiply the need for legal arbitration. An enterprise society and a judicial society, a society oriented towards the enterprise, and a society framed by a multiplicity of judicial institutions are two faces of a single phenomenon. This is something of what I would like to stress next week. In developing other consequences, other formations in the neoliberal art of government. Okay, and Foucault adds, ah yes, wait. I have something else to tell you. I'm sorry. The seminar will begin Monday the 26th. Those of you who come know that the seminar always creates problems. The seminar is usually something where you could work with 10, 20, or 30 people. Its nature and consequently its object and form change when there are 80 or 100 people. So I would have a little indication to make that is for those who do not really feel directly involved, that if they would be so kind, good. Second, the main question in the seminar will be the analysis of the transformation of juridical mechanisms in judicial institutions and of legal thought at the end of the 19th century. However, I would like to devote the first seminar to some problems of what method and possibly some discussion on the things I am talking about in the lectures. So what I would suggest for those, but only for those who have some time and who had interests, etc., that if they want to ask me some questions, that they write them for me here during the week. I will get the letters then next Wednesday, and on Monday the 26th, I will try to answer those who have asked me questions. And then the following Monday at the seminar, we will talk about themes in the history of law. Okay, that's the end of lecture 6 of the birth of Biopolitics. Michel, Foucault, College of France, 1978-79.